Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the Gasyard Feile for encouraging this discussion, which is titled See No Evil, Hear No Evil, London and Loyalist Paramilitaries. I'm Cadwallader and I'm chairing the event. As a brief introduction, after 30 years as a journalist here, I joined the Pat Finucane Centre and wrote Lethal Allies, British Collusion in Ireland, focusing on collusion and the Glenanne Gang. The PFC has organised what should be a fascinating discussion. We've invited questions online and we'll get round to them before we finish. The panellists are Dr. Brian Feeney, Professor Mark McGovern, and my colleague Margaret Irwin, who will each introduce themselves. Just as a taster of today's event, the PFC is named after the lawyer Pat Finucane. At the time of Pat's murder by the UDA in collusion with British security services, including RUC Special Branch and military intelligence, the UDA was still a legal organisation. That forms one central theme of today's discussion. Why was the largest loyalist paramilitary group responsible for taking over 400 lives during the course of the conflict legal until August 1992, just 2 years before its ceasefire in 1994? In fact, there were times during the conflict when both the UDA and the UVF were legal organisations. More of that later. Much of what we know about the relationship between loyalism and London has been uncovered, not from whistleblowers or from loyalists, but from declassified official British documents in the National Archives at Kew in London. That source makes the information revealed all the more credible and incontrovertible. We are looking at what the British were telling themselves, and sometimes in a carefully skewed way to Dublin, and it reveals their true attitude to and relations with loyalism. Belatedly, London seems to have been woken up that this amounts to a damning indictment of its stewardship of this part of the world. As a result, files which were previously open have been closed to researchers such as ourselves. Horse, stable door and bolted are words that spring to mind. Far more seriously, however, are files being left closed for decades after they should have been opened, and others that have either been destroyed or well hidden from our eyes in secret dumps around England. Files that are closed for far, far longer than they should be, including those relating to the killing of Julie Livingston, a 14-year-old child killed by a plastic bullet in 1981, and Paul Witters, a 15-year-old child also killed by a plastic bullet in 1981. Both these files have been closed for a further 40 to 50 years. On occasion, and I'm going to ask our first panelist, Margaret Irwin, about this now, when we inquire when a file is going to be opened, the response from officialdom in London is to close it for even longer. Isn't that so, Margaret?
Yes, that's right. My name is Margaret Irwin and I work for Justice for the Forgotten. I'm coordinator. We represent and support victims in the Republic, and we're part of the Pat Finucane Centre since 2010. As Anne said, I'm the author of A State in Denial, and I have a new book being published in October, which is called Fermanagh, From Plantation to Peace Process. And now to answer your question, Anne, absolutely, you have not overstated this at all. Hundreds of files are closed for anything up to 100 years, and some which may never be opened at all in the National Archives in Kew. For example, files on UDR battalions, files on British Army tours, all closed for between 84 and 100 years. A few of them, yes, are open, but many, many of them are closed. And just by way of illustration, I just want to mention one file. In A State in Denial, I mentioned this particular file, which was closed at that time for 72 years, and it was due to be opened in 2052, and it was entitled Meetings with Uda Leaders from 1976 to 1979. And I put in Freedom of Information request in August of 2017. And it took them 6 months to decide it could not be opened. And they actually had two exemptions, which was information supplied, it was personal information and health and safety. But recently I discovered, when I checked the file again in the last couple of months, I discovered that now it is closed until the 1st of January 2080. So it's closed for 100 years from the date of the closure of the file in 79. So this is what happens sometimes when you actually submit an FOI request. It actually, they obviously reviewed the file. It tells us that the file was reviewed in 2018, which was obviously because of my FOI, and they actually added a further exemption, which I think we can see there. Can we have that again for a minute, please? No, maybe not. Oh yes, here it comes now. Yes, the actual, there's a new exemption, which is now exemption 1. Information supplied by or relating to bodies dealing with security matters. So that is the reason why that file has now been closed for 100 years, an extra 28 years. 2080 is, as you see, there is the opening date. So God knows what's included in that file. And this was at a time when Roy Mason was the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. It coincides almost exactly with his term of office. And he was supposed to have stopped all these meetings. And he closed down Laneside, where senior officials met with paramilitaries from both sides. So, well, they met with Sinn Féin. They didn't meet with the IRA, but they met with the UVF and they met with the UDA, and he was supposed to have closed this down. So somebody was meeting with the leadership of the UDA during those years.
Okay, Margaret, thank you very much. How soon do you think, after the UDA emerged at the start of the conflict, do you think London knew that the UFF didn't exist and was merely a nom de guerre?
Well, they knew straight away. The name UFF emerged on the 9th of June, 73, with a new policy document. Now, when they held the press conference, they didn't mention UFF, but they had the UDA had this new policy document, and within a few hours, the UFF had claimed its first victim, 9th of June. On the 19th of June, 10 days later, the Information Policy Unit, the IPU, held a meeting where it was stated that the UFF should not be treated as a separate organisation from the UDA. So that's how they knew immediately.
Okay, tell me a bit about a couple of newly declassified files on the UDA that you've recently discovered.
Yes, they've recently been declassified, and some of them actually go back to 1980, but because they're up to maybe 86 or 87, they're only open now. And indeed, I think I mentioned in A State in Denial, I referred to a particularly cynical remark that had been made by an NIO official called Davenport, where he said that in terms of the politics of the proscription of the UDA, we have always regarded the existence of such denials as more important than their accuracy. Now, these files that are recently opened absolutely confirm that this attitude, this was policy, this was government policy. And I discovered a document relating to one of our panelists today, Brian Feeney, where he was calling in at the SDLP conference in November 1980 for the proscription of the UDA, and saying that the UFF was not a separate organisation. So there it is there.
1980, that's a long, long time ago. That's 40
yes,
years ago.
that's November 80. And
okay.
Following on, so it's just the highlighted bit there. It was public knowledge that the UFF did not exist as a distinct organisation and was simply the nom de guerre employed by the UDA members when they turned to violence. So this is in one of the new files.
Okay, Margaret.
Following on from that, there was a meeting with the SDLP in January 81. And John Hume actually raised he complained that the chief constable in his annual report for 79 had made no mention of the UDA in the context of terrorism, to which the Secretary of State, Humphrey Atkins, unbelievably replied that the difference between the UDA and the Provisional IRA was that the Provisional IRA quite frequently admits responsibility for acts of terrorism, whereas the UDA did not. So that is saying the same thing as Davenport had said.
Okay, Margaret, one of the meetings you talk about in your book, A State in Denial, is about a high-level meeting between the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and senior NIO officials with the leaderships of the UDA, the UVF, the Ulster Workers' Council, the Orange Volunteers, Down Orange Welfare, and others. What was all that about?
Well, this was August the 7th, 1974. So it was shortly after the Ulster Workers' Council brought down the power sharing executive at the end of May. And these were all the organizations who were involved in that strike. And this was a very high level meeting because the Secretary of State, Merlin Rees, was there, Stan Orme was there, very senior officials from the NIO were there. And they were meeting with all these leaders. And at this time, of course, both the UDA and the UVF were legal, because we'll be speaking about that. Maybe the UVF had been deproscribed in May of 74 as well. And they had a meeting with all these organizations, the leadership of them. And what they wanted was, they wanted complete control of security by the RUC and the UDR. And they wanted a third force called a Home Guard, based on along the lines of the B Specials. And they wanted an increase in numbers in the UDR. They wanted an increase in numbers in the RUC, and they didn't want British Army officers in charge of UDR battalions. We know that the British Army, that each battalion was, the top guy was British officer, and that was because they didn't trust the UDR. But this was what they were demanding, and they wanted 2 full-time UDR battalions. And as early as the following month, they started to expand the RUC, and in response to this demand at the meeting, the NIO agreed to increasing the numbers of the UDR, the RUC reserve, the RUC, and the only thing they rejected was the Home Guard for obvious reasons. And within 18 months, in fact, they had formed the 2 battalions, the full-time battalions, which had also been, and there's actually a memo to say this was first suggested at this meeting. So, you know, they had great powers, great influence with the NIO, so that they were able to get most of what they asked for.
Tell me a bit about Andy Tierry looking for a firearms certificate. Andy Tierry, of course, for those of us who go back that far, was the leader of the UDA during much of the conflict.
The Supreme Commander, he called himself. Yes, in 1975, the UDA in particular, but also the UVF, were constantly meeting with the NIO. This was at a time when the IRA were on ceasefire. And in order to placate the loyalists, they were meeting very constantly with them in Laneside. And but there was a clandestine meeting between Andy Tierry and very senior official James Allen, and that was on the 24th of March 1975. And he said that he wanted James Allen's help in procuring a license for a firearm for his protection. Now, he was only accompanied by his bodyguard, and James Allen suggested that it might be difficult for Tierry to get a firearms license, but he suggested that perhaps his bodyguard could apply. And he said he would find out which police station to which he should apply. So I thought that was quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
But we don't know if he was successful. I haven't found any document to say that he definitely got one.
Right, thank you very much, Margaret. Now, I want now to turn to our second panelist, Professor Mark McGovern. Mark, you've recently published your own book, Counterinsurgency and Collusion in Northern Ireland. Could you introduce yourself and then explain how the words collusion and counterinsurgency are linked in a Northern Ireland context?
Okay, thanks, Anne. First of all, can I just say thank you to the Pat Finucane Centre and the Gasyard Feile for inviting me to take part today. Although obviously, given the circumstances, it didn't give me the chance to get home on this occasion, but sure, maybe another time. Yeah, my name's Mark McGovern. I'm Professor of Sociology at Edgehill University, which is just outside Liverpool. I've been writing about issues to do with transitional justice and state violence for several years now. And as you said, I published a book last year called Counterinsurgency and Collusion in Northern Ireland. And the book, which was the product really of a long-term collaboration with Relatives for Justice, and in particular Mark Thompson of Relatives for Justice, looked at a series of several dozen killings of loyalist killings, mostly of Republicans or people who were from Republican families in mid-Ulster in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And there was a huge spate, particularly by the mid-Ulster UVF, but also by the UDA. A spate of killings that took place at that time, and I think it forms a quite distinct phase of the kind of counterinsurgency campaign that the state put into action. It has continuities, not least, for example, as you know, in terms of what happened in mid-Ulster that you yourself looked at so thoroughly, Anne, in your own book. But it also has this, I think, very particular moment. When the state uses agents and informers in particular throughout this phase in a very specific way. And I suppose the book wanted to do a couple of things. First of all, it wanted to, and it's based very much on the voices of the families. It sought to ensure that the voices of the families of the victims was at the center of telling the story of what took place at that time. It wanted, in that sense, too, to contribute to building that kind of evidence base, showing in terms of the historical record what collusion involved. But it also sought, and thus the reference to counterinsurgency in the title, it also sought to place that within a kind of wider and longer term context. And that is the context of British counterinsurgency theory and practice. Now, counterinsurgency here is referring to the various kind of military, policing, political, economic, psychological, and other means by which the state and its agencies seek to defeat an insurgency. And there's been a kind of a notion, at least, that British approaches, and this was something very much kind of valorized over recent times, the British approach to counterinsurgency was somehow different. As Mike Jackson, former chief of staff of the British Army, and of course one of the people responsible for the events of Bloody Sunday, once referred to he called it a kind of peculiarly British way of counterinsurgency, which is supposed to be characterized by a more benign hearts and minds and minimum force doctrine. In other words, that the force used is only ever the absolute minimum that can be used. And I think that's a problem, and I think it's a problem that's kind of shaped this kind of myth of British counterinsurgency is something that's shaped the discussion both about state killings and about collusion, because I don't think that's also the case. And one of the things that I wanted to do was therefore to place the kind of logic that I think is evident in the approach that the British state adopted in the North, not least in terms of its use of agents and informers, and for example, kind of like proxy organizations like loyalist groups, that actually fitted into a logic of rather a doctrine of necessity rather than a minimum force doctrine. This is a doctrine, I think, shaped by the idea that whatever force was needed is what was the logic of British counterinsurgency. And that has, as I say, a longer term history. It goes beyond the kind of the Kitsons, etc. So even, for example, right back to what the British, who the British Army regards as the founder of the tradition of British counterinsurgency, is a late 19th century military man called Charles Colwell, Major General Charles Colwell. Colwell actually, and not I think unimportantly, was from the north. He was of good Ulster capital and Anglo-Irish landed stock. And he developed this concept of what he referred to as moral force, that which was the way that the small wars of empire should be fought. And what he meant by that actually is a synonym really for inspiring awestruck fear in a population. Moral force was actually about using the violence, a kind of performance of violence, which would therefore undermine the capacity of communities to resist the will of the imperial state, as it were. And I think that's a better foundation for understanding the sort of logic that underpinned the character of the kind of campaign fought in the north, and particularly in places like Mid-Ulster, and particularly in periods like the late 1980s and early 1990s, when actually what was going on here was deploying whatever force the state felt necessary to meet its own interests and ends in order to achieve its goal, which was essentially to demoralize communities of people that it had targeted.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, you and I and Margaret and Brian and others as well have done a tremendous amount of work in trying to change the dominant narrative about the conflict. And as a result of that, there's been a kickback from the establishment. How successful do you think that response from the establishment, from politicians, right-wing militarists and the rest of them, has been in framing the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's kind of from where you stand, and also the jury is just literally still out in many ways. You know, in terms of its longer term success, I guess we'll have to see. Certainly, I think it's had a profoundly detrimental and divisive effect on the sort of debate that we should be having about the legacy of the conflict. You know, in terms, you know, and we've seen this kind of operating at both government level and in kind of, if you like, a kind of populist campaigns too. You know, clearly, you know, government efforts to introduce kind of statute of limitations or basically some form of amnesty by another name for former British soldiers accused of extrajudicial killings has kind of operated at that kind of official level. But it's been kind of both fed and underpinned and driven too by kind of populist campaigns, both in Britain, the sort of, you know, led by kind of the right-wing press and led by kind of political figures and former military figures who kind of utilize this language and rhetoric and narrative of a witch hunt to kind of describe things. And then also echoed, I think, closer to home, as it were, by, you know, people talking about a legacy scandal. And it has had, I think, an extremely difficult and problematic impact. I think it's sort of impacted on the kind of ways in which people are able to discuss these things. And more importantly, as I say, these populist campaigns have fed this, you know, this logic of a disproportionate focus, as the saying goes, the notion that somehow the way in which legacy issues and legacy mechanisms are being introduced and potential prosecutions are being undertaken has had a disproportionate focus on people in the state, even though, and I think this is not unimportant, even at the same time when that case is being made both by government officials and in a kind of populist context, even when people like the Chief Constable of the PSNI and the Victims Commissioner have said that the evidence doesn't show that to be the case, that in fact the evidence says the exact opposite, that that's not what we've seen. We haven't seen a disproportionate focus on cases. And I suppose the problem here is, I think what we're seeing is a kind of, perhaps a re-emergence, certainly a kind of a reinforcement of kind of forms of denial, the kind of politics of denial, that again, I think is in a wider sense is a problem for our civic spaces, our capacity to discuss these issues. And, you know, if we take the kind of work of someone like Stan Cohen, the sociologist Stan Cohen, you know, we see these different forms of denial, from sort of literal denial that you know, these things didn't happen, there was no collusion, which of course was the story that we heard for far too long. And when people embark on that, and we've seen that kind of being said, it's not, you know, it's not just the likes of us who people are saying this in relation to. They're saying it in relation to, you know, a record now established from John Stevens through Nuala O'Loan, through De Silva, onto the Lough Island report and others. We've seen, in other words, you know, if evidence being put into the public realm of collusion as a formative dimension of the conflict. So it's either literal denial, or it's kind of, that might have happened, but it's not what you think. In you know, different interpretations, which include, of course, contesting the very definition. We see a kind of literature now too, both again in the kind of academic and also in the kind of populist realm, of kind of dismissing or disputing the concept of collusion itself, and seeing, and, you know, trying to construct it as somehow merely a political term, not something that we can use in either legal or academic senses to analyze the shape of things. Or we see it in terms of what Cohen referred to as implicatory denial. In other words, it might be that might have been the case, and you might be right in your understanding of it. But what we should do about that isn't what you think you would normally think should be the consequence. And that, you know, if we see that this kind of package of denial coming together, it sort of shaped the space and the way in which these issues are now being discussed. And as I say, I think, you know, it's an ongoing problem, but it's one that needs to be, you know, faced down in terms of the way in which it's attempting to reshape and redefine the discussion we should be having.
It's I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience as well. It's years since Lethal Allies was published. It's a year since your book was published, and none of the details have been challenged. None of the evidence has been challenged. But nevertheless, it does seem to be a Sisyphean task to push the rock up the mountain and somehow break through the glass wall, and to let ordinary decent people in Britain, where you live and I'm from, know the truth about what happened over here. It's an almost impossible task, especially when you have increasing militarism and the kind of English nationalism that you see in the Brexit debate. But I guess we just have to keep going. When the going gets tough, the tough get going.
Absolutely. No, and you're absolutely right about that. And it should tell us something when people don't want to talk about the evidence base, right? When there's evidence put forward and they don't want to talk about that, they want rather to kind of talk about other things. I think that tells us something about where we're at with matters, and I completely agree with you. That tends to be the way it is. So again, you know, so people will you look at that evidence in terms of what's been produced as limited in some senses as it is, that, you know, through various kind of official reports, and yet people can still stand up and say, you know, directly contradict, you know, that evidence base without addressing it, without actually being questioned about, well, how can you say X when Y is obviously in the public record? You know,
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to our final panelist, Brian Feeney. Brian, could you introduce yourself and then tell us why, although you were arguing, as Margaret said, as long ago as November 1980, that the UDA should be banned by London, why do you think your calls were ignored?
Hello, my name is Brian Feeney. I used to be in politics until about 25 years ago. Since then, I've turned to writing. I'm one of the authors of Lost Lives, the stories of the men, women, and children killed in the Northern Ireland Troubles. I've written a number of other books about the Troubles. One, the history of a figure in the IRA called Jerry Bradley, who was active for more than 30 years. I'd also like to say I'm very grateful to the Gasyard Feile. They give me the opportunity to come on to talk about this. In answer to your question, when I was making that proposal, proposing that resolution in 1980 about banning the UDA, just to put it in context, the November 1980 was the time, and the prison crisis was reaching a peak, and the first hunger strike was beginning in December 1980. But from 1979 there had been a concerted series of attacks by the UDA, murders of leaders of anti-hitch block campaigns. And they picked the intellectual leaders in many cases. And UDA had killed John Turnley, who was an Irish independence figure from Carnlough, who had been from a wealthy Protestant landed gentry background. They killed Miriam Daly, who was a lecturer in Queen's. They had actually planned to kill her husband, but he was in Dublin, and when he didn't turn up, they shot her instead. They waited in the house for a considerable period of time, and then they shot her. They also shot Ronnie Bunting and Noel Little, who were INLA figures. And finally, after that resolution that I was proposing, they shot Bernadette McCalliskey. It was the same squad. Everyone knew who they were. They were the South Belfast Brigade, which stretched out to Lisburn of the UDA. They were a unit led by John McMichael, and he tried to pretend or let it be known that he was involved with the UFF. The squad that did this, there were only 9 men in it, and everyone knew, including the security forces, and nothing was done about it. Now, because of the intensity of the killings that were taking place against these targeted figures who were opposed to the H-block conditions, the claim that they were the UFF was quite important, because the pressure was on to ban the UDA. And the argument was, oh, well, actually, this is not this is the UFF, who are, if you like, the military wing of the UDA, which is complete nonsense. The British had taken a decision long before this not to ban the UDA for various reasons. One of them they used to give was it was too big. And if they were banned, they'd be driven underground, and then they'd become much more dangerous. Hard to imagine how they'd become more dangerous since they were given such freedom of action by the security forces in any case. The other reason, and this is more like the real reason, is that the UDA was actually a pseudo-gang, as the British call these things. They had done this sort of thing everywhere. And many of the officers who were involved at a senior level in the early 70s that Margaret was referring to, 73, 74, 75, they had participated in colonial struggles against the British, defending the empire in Kenya, Malaya, Borneo, Aden, and they came to the north of Ireland and in many ways followed the same policies. And one of the key elements in that policy was to pick an ethnic group or a tribe or someone who would be supportive of the British, arm those people and set them against another ethnic group. One of the best examples is Cyprus, where the British colluded with the Turkish Cypriots against the Greek Cypriots who were trying to organize independence. There's another example in Malaya, where the Chinese and the Malayans were tiered off against each other. Same in Kenya, same in Uganda, and the same in the north of Ireland, where they backed one group against the other. And it's quite obvious that the sort of evidence that Margaret was giving earlier about the regular meetings with the UDA, that they were the favoured group and they turned a blind eye. But in many cases, as in 1979, 1980, the UDA were actually carrying out the work of the British Army, because the British Army couldn't actually go in and shoot people like Miriam Daly or John Turnley. But they were thorns in the side of the authorities. So when the UDA shot them, they were actually doing a favour for the authorities. And you have to ask, why did they pick those people? Who gave them the details? Where did they get the details? And as in many other cases, the finger points back to the British Army or MI5.
You must still find it pretty depressing, I know Margaret does, and probably Mark as well, that people still refer to the UFF as though it was an existing organisation, when anybody who's given any thought to it or addressed the issue at all knows that it doesn't exist, but it's still referred to.
That's right. It never
The
existed.
mainstream press and broadcasters.
Yeah, it never existed. And I mean, when we were writing the Lost Lives book, we tried to be very careful not to give any credibility to the UFF and constantly referred to the perpetrators of sectarian murder as the UDA or the UVF. But there are simple questions. I mean, where was the UFF wing in Long Kesh? There wasn't one. There was only the IRA, the UVF, the UDA. But let me quote Da Silva in his report on this particular point. It's paragraph 2510. It's page 495 of volume 1 of his giant reports. And he says, the supposed distinction between the UDA and the UFF was in fact a fiction. And that's an official report. There was never a distinction. It enabled the British government to say, oh no, the UDA is actually a widely based community organization and their military wing is the UFF, which is banned.
So far, we've been discussing the influence that loyalist paramilitaries had with London, but I want to diverge a bit and talk about the influence and collaboration between loyalists and mainstream unionist politicians who always insist that they came down hard on the UDA, that they came down hard on loyalism, that there weren't any conduits between the two groups. Do you have concrete examples of where this was in fact not true?
Yeah, it's complete nonsense. I mean, probably the best example is the collusion between Jim Molyneux, the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, and the UDA in the Lisburn area, edging in his constituency in South Antrim, where Molyneux actually met them. He's photographed meeting a sort of a guard of honour of the UDA and colluded with them to try to prevent the building of Twinbrook, the Twinbrook estate, which was going to be West Belfast overflow. And Lisburn Council, again, supported and influenced by Jim Molyneux, refused to carry out any council activities in Twinbrook. They had to be prosecuted. They wouldn't empty the bins. But what Molyneux and the Unionists were doing was trying to encourage the UDA to get involved, to intimidate people so that they wouldn't move into the Twinbrook area. There are loads of examples. I mean, when I was a councillor in Belfast City Hall, regularly Unionist politicians would meet the UDA and indeed the UVF brigade staff, who were quite often to be seen having a drink in the Lord Mayor's parlour. They also drank in the same drinking clubs. Not only the Unionist politicians with the UDA, but Unionist politicians, prison officers, UDA. I mean, one of the best places you could find quite a collection of them was a drinking club close to the Long Kesh prison, which was frequented by prison officers. The sort of people, they didn't know which uniform to put on when they got up in the morning, whether it was a prison officer, RUC Reserve, UDR, or a balaclava. Who could tell?
When it comes to the case of someone like Brian Nelson, for example, do you think he was influencing the UDA campaign, or was it a question of British military intelligence influencing the UDA campaign through Nelson? Who was influencing who?
It's a bit of both, actually. Nelson was a former British Army soldier, and when he came back after numbers of years in the British Army, he was actually approached and encouraged to join the UDA and encouraged to rise through the ranks, and was given all kinds of tidbits of information which enabled him to get promoted in the UDA because he seemed to acquire this kind of information. Now, he was working largely for the British Army and for the unit called the Force Research Unit, the FRU, and they would give him targets. And much the same way as I was describing earlier, the way anti-H block protesters were targeted, the FRU would give Nelson targets, provide him with photographs of people's houses, their cars, and close-up, high-quality photographs of the people themselves. And he would then make proposals to the UDA. We know as well that Nelson wanted certain people killed himself, that the army didn't actually have to give him targets. He sometimes thought of targets himself. But there's no doubt he was being run as a British Army agent and doing the work that the British Army was unable to do openly by obviously going in and just shooting someone in a house. The UDA did the work for them. And Nelson, there's a lot of stuff about Nelson that never came out, including at his trial where he didn't go into the witness box and couldn't be cross-examined. But there's lots of stuff about him, not just his involvement in targeting people and arranging their killing, particularly in Belfast, but also his role in supplying weapons to the loyalists after 1985, after the Anglo-Irish Agreement and after the big influx of weaponry for the IRA from Libya. The British evened that up by supplying the UDA and the UVF with weapons, mostly from South Africa. And Brian Nelson was involved in that. And he wouldn't have been doing that if he hadn't been told and shown how to do it by the British Army.
Brian, the standard response when the evidence is presented, either in documentary form, in book form, or wherever, in the newspapers or wherever, the standard response from the RUC, ex-RUC and current PSNI is that they did everything they could to put loyalists behind bars, that they come out with statistics saying, look at all these loyalists that we put away for long periods of time in jail. And although it seems on the surface to be statistically an honest response, both you and I think, have very great doubts about who they put in jail and for how long, and it's more complex than it seems.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, some of the best work was done by Nuala O'Lone when she was the police ombudsman and showed quite clearly that there were informers who were passing information about people who were going to be killed, passing information to their RUC special branch handlers, and absolutely was nothing done about, nothing was done as a result of that information. People were allowed to die. People were chosen to be used by MI5 and RUC Special Branch. And I mean, there are so many examples where the security forces knew exactly who carried out the killings. I mentioned the case of John McMichael and his squad, where Ray Smallwoods was heavily involved, did a lot of the driving. Smallwoods was shot dead by the IRA in 1994. He was involved in the killing of Bernadette Devlin. They knew all this perfectly well. There's another example I can give you of a man called Terence McDade, who was shot dead in Newington. And this was a case of mistaken identity. What do they mean by mistaken identity? Because the army had given him the wrong information and he went and shot Terence McDade. Now, there was a soldier prosecuted for passing information, a guy called Cameron Hasty, Corporal Cameron Hasty. The information was being given to loyalists from Girdwood Barracks. And the army would withdraw its patrols to allow the killing to take place. So they allowed certain people to be killed. They assumed they were killing an IRA man. It was a mistake. But they decided to allow this to happen. So they would allow certain people to be killed. They would allow Republicans to be killed. They would allow certain loyalists to be sent to jail. But the targets they wanted, they carried out perfectly well. They gave the information. And a lot of the information is available in De Silva about the meetings that took place. A lot of it's redacted, but you can see the meetings that took place and the information that was coming from the UDA and the UVF to the RUC and to Special Branch.
And we can all, I suppose, point to certain people who led charmed lives, such as Robin Jackson in the 70s and Billy Wright in the 80s, who on many occasions, I can think of 5 occasions at least on which Robin Jackson could have been put away for a long sentence and somehow evaded that fate. But I find it very interesting. I think it's very important for us to lift our eyes above the horizon a bit and look at what the British did in other parts of the world before they came to Northern Ireland and what they've done since the conflict here largely ended as well. And I think, you know, we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking Ireland was unique in any way. Those are my thoughts. If anybody wants to comment on that.
Well, I mentioned earlier, you're absolutely right. The senior officers in the early 70s were highly experienced in activities in places like Aden, Malaya, Borneo, Kenya. It was absolutely scandalous what went on there. People assume that have done research in it, they can only tell it must have been more than 12,000 people killed in Kenya, many by hanging, some by starvation, some were tortured to death, and they set one group against another. And the same sort of thing that went on here went on in Iraq. If you remember the hooded men and the promise that this would never happen again, the 5 techniques, and then it turns out that the same 5 techniques were being used in Iraq in 2003, 2004.
Do you want to come in on that, Mark? Because I think you've done some work on that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think even if we look at the news in the last couple of weeks around Operation Northmoor, which was the supposed investigations into extrajudicial killings by British troops in Afghanistan, and the recent allegations that there was a supposedly rogue SAS unit operating to kill unarmed people, going into villages in the dead of night and killing people in those villages. We sit and kind of go, yeah, no surprise. You know what I mean? It doesn't come as a surprise because you see continuities in the kinds of practices that have been that have taken place. And likewise, I think in terms of, if we look at the case of Afghanistan again, there was the case of Marine A, who was a soldier who was actually caught on webcam. There was a head camera of him shooting dead a wounded Afghan fighter. And he was charged for that. It was one of the very rare occasions when anyone's been held accountable for it and anyone's been held, found guilty for it. What did we witness? We witnessed a campaign by the right-wing press. We witnessed a campaign led by former military figures, which resulted, apart from anything else, that Marine A was released from jail 2.5 years into his sentence for murder. This is Lee Clegg. This is the kinds of cases we have seen before, where accountability, not only in terms then of the kind of violence that's been undertaken, but the lack of an accountability is an ongoing issue. And this is one of the reasons why, the discussions we have and the cases we look at here are not just about here. They're also about trying to establish norms of accountability in terms of state violence and in terms of the actions of the state, because this is not simply a matter of the past. It's a matter of the present. It's happened in these other instances. It's happened in these other campaigns. One of the defenses, for example, there was a documentary made about the Marine A case, and one of the kind of defenses put forward by some of the other soldiers was, he shouldn't be being held accountable for this. This is the sort of thing lots of people did. You think about that, and that's about a kind of establishing, there are often kind of spaces of sort of silences, if you like, within institutions about what is permissible and what is not permissible. And what you create is these cultures of impunity in the context of kind of like institutional settings, such as the British military, where people kind of know that there's certain things that they can do or cannot do. And I think those kinds of spaces are what we've seen throughout the kind of operation of British counterinsurgency campaigns.
Just briefly, let's talk a bit about pseudo gangs. Margaret, you were one of we hear a lot about the military reaction force now because their actions are under the microscope again, but Margaret, you were one of the first people to look at the military reaction force that was basically undercover soldiers operating from cars, shooting people at will during the early days of the conflict. And more recently, that people are having another look at what they did, but you were one of the first ones to highlight the military reaction force, a pseudo gang, a counter gang, part of counterinsurgency tactics. Yes,
well, I produced a pamphlet in, I think it was 2013, about counter gangs in the 1970s, which mainly dealt with the military reaction force. And now it's a bit out of date because we have learned a bit more information since then. For
Information
example,
comes dropping slow.
yeah, for example, you know, I say in that booklet that the Conway brothers were shot by the MRF. In fact, they weren't. They were shot by the reconnaissance unit of the King's Own Scottish Borderers. One, Julian Ball, was responsible, who was later involved with Robert Nairac down in Castledillan. But apart from that, I think it pretty much stands up. And the MRF were very, very active, of course, in '72. And then, but they were very careless and a bit chaotic. And they brought the house down really with the Foursquare Laundry.
And then the counterinsurgency tactic and the use of pseudo gangs got much more sophisticated and much more deniable.
And they were replaced by the Special Reconnaissance Unit. It's now generally called 14th Intelligence, but certainly in all the documents of the time, 1974 documents, it's called the SRU, or the Special Reconnaissance Unit. And all of those who were involved in that were former SAS. They were sort of seconded for the SAS, and there was a, you know, they could deny the fact that there were actually SAS members involved, because they would have been out of the SAS for a period of time. But then that was reduced, and then eventually they were allowing SAS to come straight into the SRU, and they were all trained, of course, by the SAS.
They all have so many acronyms, so many different names, culminating in the Force Research Unit or Force Reconnaissance Unit involved in the murder of Pat Finucane. Just returning to the murder of Pat Finucane, now this is a question for all of the panelists, Margaret first and then Mark and Brian. In the De Silva report into the murder of Pat Finucane, De Silva says he could find no evidence of British government ministers tolerating the activities of loyalist paramilitaries. Now, I'd like to know what you all think of that conclusion by Lord De Silva. Margaret.
Well, I think everything that's been said so far in this discussion would prove that to be a false assertion. From the very start, the UDA, as Brian said, was the favoured, very much favoured, above the UVF, although they had their periods of favouritism as well, but right through the conflict. And of course, today is the anniversary of the day when the UDA was finally proscribed on the 10th of August 1992. It took 2 decades. So I think all of the books that we've produced and so on prove that is totally false. From the very start, they were being allowed to patrol. And we've seen photographs of the UDA patrolling with the British Army. And we know on the day that the first IRA ceasefire broke down on the 9th of July 72, that Tuzo had written a big document about what was going to happen when the ceasefire broke down. So it was fully anticipated that this was going to happen, that they might have to turn a blind eye, and they actually use that. He uses that term. This is Harry Tuzo, the General Officer Commanding, that they might have to turn a blind eye to UDA carrying arms in their own areas. They would be confined to their own areas, however they intended to do that.
Okay, Mark, what do you think of De Silva's conclusion?
Well, I mean, the De Silva report is extremely important, and it has provided a lot of information and a lot of useful information for us. But I think we also need to see its limitations, and I think in 2 ways I'd sort of point to some of the issues that mean that he may possibly arrive at that conclusion. The first is in terms of evidence. He said, he says he can't find any evidence. Well, there's some questions I think about the evidence base that De Silva had. He was supposed to have had absolutely everything. But let's take another instance, or specific instance, to which Brian in part referred to. De Silva uses discussion about the importation of weapons, and in particular 1987 importation of weapons, which essentially rearmed loyalism and allowed it to become the most lethal group agent in the conflict by the early 1990s. And De Silva kind of looks at that, and he says, and he makes a point of saying, if you can demonstrate that the British didn't know about this, the British intelligence services didn't know about this, then that refutes allegations that loyalists were merely death squads. That's the weight that he gives to that. Now, and he says that there was no evidence. He basically makes a case in the report that there was no evidence that there was foreknowledge of the importation of the 1987 weapons from South Africa. Roll on just a few years later, and we have the Loughlin Island report. And in the Loughlin Island report, chapter and verse of the extent of the foreknowledge of British intelligence agencies, the number of informers that they had, the clarity that they had about precisely what was going to take place, precisely the nature of the importation of the weapons that was going to occur, alongside then all the what should we say, the rather problematic way in which the searches for weapons then continued thereafter. So, within a few years, the supposed evidence that De Silva relies upon is absolutely countered by someone else who must have had access, to records that either De Silva didn't have or didn't interpret in a way that we might think was reasonable. And
okay, Brian, very briefly, we're reaching the end of our hour now.
Sorry. Well, I think also in similar vein, the conclusion he arrived at are about interpretation. So, for example, he spends a lot of the report talking about the high-level meetings, including government ministers, about whether or not rules should be introduced for the handling of agents and informers. And they did for several years, and they happen at every possible level. They're brought forward by senior members of the military and the RUC, not, it should be said, to stop the practices that they were discussing, but actually to ensure that they wouldn't be held culpable for them afterwards. And nothing was done. Nothing was done. Now, if he wants to interpret that as a lack of understanding or knowledge of loyalist activity, that's a matter of interpretation.
Okay, and finally, Brian, just to close now.
I know for a fact that ministers knew. From private conversations with Nicholas Scott, he was a minister here for many years, he just took it for granted. The politicians on the nationalist side would make representations to ministers about collusion, about the stuff that was happening, about what was being allowed to happen. And they knew perfectly well. There is a little thing in De Silva where he points out that there were briefings by senior figures in Stormont to ministers and in Westminster, but they were always careful that what the minister knew was deniable, and that the briefings were constructed in such a way to provide deniability. And that
brings us neatly round to the title of today's discussion, which was See No Evil, Hear No Evil.
Yeah.
Okay, well, listen, thank you all very, very much indeed. It's been a really interesting hour, and I hope that the audience finds it as interesting as I certainly have. Thank you all very much, and thank you again to the Gasyard Feile for providing this opportunity for us all to get together and talk these issues over. Thank you again, and have a good day. Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Bye.